Good day. Today is Saturday, 30th August 2025, and I am making this program shortly after the US Court of Appeals of the relevant federal district basically upheld an earlier decision made in May by the US Court of International Trade, which ruled that the president's decision to impose various tariffs on many countries around the world, most countries around the world, was illegal and unconstitutional. To say briefly, the Constitution of the United States vests the power to raise tax on Congress. Tariffs are a type of tax. It's far from clear. It's never been obvious to me upon what legal authority Donald Trump has been imposing the various tariffs which he has been imposing. He has relied, to be precise, on legislation that gave the President of the United States powers to deal with various types of economic emergency. But in its ruling, the US Court of Appeals basically sided with the Court of International Trade by saying that the way in which the president has been imposing tariffs really isn't consistent with his claim that he's dealing with an economic emergency. Now, I will say this was a 7-4 decision, and I'm not familiar with the thinking of the minority, which presumably has sided with the president. And this isn't the final decision in this case. There will no doubt now be an appeal by the president to the Supreme Court of the United States, which will look to this issue and make its own decision, which will be presumably final. Now, I'm not going to discuss this case in any great detail in this program. We touched on many of the issues in a live stream we did with on the Duran with the US Attorney Robert Barnes. Robert Barnes is somebody who's argued cases in the Supreme Court of the United States, has a far stronger grasp of US constitutional law than obviously I do. And, well, he was already starting to worry that the president's legal position was becoming increasingly shaky. And he said that, in his opinion, though the president had had a reasonable case before and a reasonable chance of succeeding in the case before, the way that sanctions and tariffs have become conflated with each other over the last few months, with President Trump imposing tariffs on Brazil, in part at least because he was unhappy about Brazil's treatment of the former president, President Bolsonaro, and the restrictions Brazil was placing on US social media sites, and the way in which the president has also threatened various countries around the world with tariffs if they import oil from Russia, that all of this has undermined the premise that these are tariffs at all, and has undermined his own argument that he was actually dealing with an economic emergency. And apparently, and according to Robert Barnes, some weeks ago, just before we did the live stream with him, judges of the US Court of Appeals were actually asking pertinent questions about the rationale of imposing tariffs in the kind of cases that I've described. So, perhaps, in a sense, this decision is unsurprising, and though I'm not going to try and second guess what the Supreme Court of the United States is going to do, I personally find it difficult to argue with the thinking that the majority has outlined in its decision. To repeat again, I am not an expert in this area of the law at all. I'm not an expert in US tariff or tax policy or tax law or the constitutional law of the United States. So my opinions here carry little weight. And if the Supreme Court of the United States takes a different decision and sides with the president, well, I'm not going to be the person to push back against that. But on the face of it, to me, it looks like the president is going into the arena of the Supreme Court of the United States with what I feel is the weaker legal argument. Now, that puts the president potentially in a very difficult position if the Supreme Court of the United States decides against him and chooses to uphold the decisions of the two lower courts, the US Court of International Trade and the US Court of Appeals, which has just made this decision. If that happens, then all of the various tariffs that the president has been imposing are unconstitutional and therefore illegal. That puts a huge question mark over the various trade deals that the president has claimed to have negotiated on the basis of the various, in that case, unconstitutional tariffs which he has been levying. It's important to say that most of these trade deals have not, so far as I'm aware, been ratified by any parliament. So they will presumably, on that basis, they will presumably vanish away. And of course, the key policy upon which the president was elected, and the one which I suspect he has by far the deepest emotional commitment to, will have been blown away. Now, the president could in theory do two things. He could go to Congress and he could ask Congress to give him legislative authority to impose the tariffs which he has been trying to impose. The decision of the US Court of Appeals says that Congress does indeed have the power to do precisely this. The problem is, I'm far from convinced that there is a majority in Congress, in either the Senate or the House, to enable the president to do this thing, except in one possible respect. And that brings us back to Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal's bill for bone-crushing sanctions against Russia. The bill would impose sanctions, tariffs, on any country that imports Russian oil. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has insisted that the right to make the decision as to whether to impose tariffs or not must be his and his alone. Well, we now have a bill in Congress which we are told has the support of a majority of the Senate. Lindsey Graham says 80 senators, which purportedly would give the president authority to impose tariffs on any country that was importing Russian oil products. And given the extent to which Russia is at the center of the global energy trade, I don't think it will be particularly difficult to find reasoning and rationale upon which the United States, the president, could say that any particular country in any part of the world, including, by the way, the European Union, is indeed violating this law, enabling him to impose tariffs and sanctions in effect upon it. So suddenly, as of this morning, the bill, the Graham Blumenthal bill, suddenly becomes much more attractive. And it may indeed be the fallback that the president turns to in the event that he loses his case in the Supreme Court of the United States. So this, in my opinion, disastrously misconceived bill might finally acquire a purpose, a use for the president himself. He will no doubt try to persuade Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal to modify the bill in order to give the president himself freedom to impose tariffs as he chooses. But it will give him the legal authority to do that. And it's likely that Graham and Blumenthal will exact a heavy price if the bill is indeed presented, and they might indeed insist on congressional oversight of the president's decisions. So here we have a legal judgment from courts in the United States, which I have to say, on balance, I think is correct, but which could very well end up bringing about a change in the law in the United States and a change in American policy, with which I personally would not agree with at all. Anyway, there it is. That is what I'm going to say about this issue in this program. No doubt an awful lot more can be said, but I will leave the whole topic there. We will no doubt be doing a program looking into this issue, exploring it further on the Duran itself, but that's all I'm going to say about it today. Now, in the meantime, even as the president has to think and worry about these court decisions, and which, as I said, are putting into question the entire flagship policy of his administration, there is a growing argument starting to build between the Europeans and the President of the United States and the administration. There's been reports, which I believe to be true, that the Europeans have been trying to press Trump to make public statements condemning the Russian missile and drone strike on Kiev, the one that took place, I believe it was now 3 days ago. I should say that last night the Russians launched another big combined drone and missile strike across Ukraine, which did also, however, in part conduct missile and drone strike on Kiev itself. So Kiev has suffered from more Russian drone and missile strikes over the last couple of hours, just to say. But anyway, the Europeans have been pushing very hard for the president to try to get the president of the United States to make statements condemning this strike. And they've been doing so by publishing comments on social media, especially on X, but I suspect there's also been private communications as well. The president so far has remained basically silent on this question, and apparently the private messaging that the Europeans have been receiving from the Americans, from the administration, which has dismayed them and alarmed them exceedingly, is that the president apparently sees these latest Russian drone and missile strikes on Kiev as retaliation for Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries. So the president is trying to find some equivalence between these two things. And understandably and unsurprisingly, this has caused deep dismay in Europe. Well, that's one area of tension between the Americans and the Europeans, or to be more precise, between the European governments and the Trump administration. But it looks to me as if there's another as well. Because late yesterday, the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, published an extremely stern message condemning criticism of President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. Apparently, what Vance was homing in on was an article which appeared in Politico, which basically made the same points as the article in Reuters about Witkoff, which I discussed in my program yesterday. In my program yesterday, I said that the Europeans had been bewildered by the information that Witkoff had given, that they were very critical of the fact that Witkoff went into the meeting with Putin, the meeting that took place prior to the summit meeting between Putin and Trump. They were bewildered by Witkoff's accounts of this meeting. They understood Witkoff to say in the first discussion that they had with him that Putin had agreed to withdraw Russian troops from Zaporozhye and Kherson region if the Ukrainians withdrew from Donbass, from Donetsk region. The Europeans didn't believe that. Then in the next meeting, Witkoff supposedly told them that what Putin had actually said is that he was not expecting the Western powers to recognize Zaporozhye and Kherson as part of Russia, that international recognition of these two regions was not a Russian demand, which of course leaves open the question of whether international recognition of Russian control of Crimea and of Donetsk and Lugansk region is a Russian demand. But anyway, let's put that aside. Anyway, so according to the Europeans, there was muddle and confusion about what Witkoff was saying and about what Witkoff was saying Putin had said to him. And apparently the Europeans were annoyed about the fact that Witkoff went into the meeting with Putin, that there was no person from the State Department there to take notes, so that it was very, very difficult to get a clear understanding of what Putin and Witkoff had actually said to each other. Well, Vance is now saying that all of this is fake, it's false. There's never been any point when Witkoff has misled anybody about his discussions with Putin. That to make that claim is absurd. Vance says that he has access to all the intelligence and that he knows exactly what the discussions were, that the meeting with Putin was indeed a success, that the issues were narrowed to the questions of security guarantees and territory, and that whilst Vance cannot say with any certainty that as a result of all of these diplomatic contacts, peace will indeed be achieved in Ukraine. If peace is indeed achieved in Ukraine, it will be because of the actions of President Trump and the good offices and hard work of his envoy, Stephen Witkoff. So Vance stands firmly behind Witkoff and is pushing back on much of this media commentary that we have seen about Witkoff. Commentary that says that he's out of his depth, that he's incompetent, that he isn't really up to the job of diplomatic negotiations with the Russians, that the Russians are running rings around him. There's been article after article, especially in the European media, but also some articles in the American media that tell us all of those things. So that is what Vance is saying. And he has some basis for saying it. There have been extraordinary articles appearing especially in the European media over the last couple of hours. Now, I'm going to give one example, and that is an article that has appeared yesterday in the Financial Times, and which continues to be there in the Financial Times today. Now, this article claims that the President, Donald Trump, has been considering sending Chinese peacekeepers to patrol any buffer zone that is agreed as a result of a negotiation between between the Ukraine and Russia. If there's going to be a final settlement, there's a lot of talk about buffer zones now, and supposedly Chinese troops, the president is considering deploying Chinese troops to patrol this buffer zone and to do various other things on this territory. Now, this is based on information provided to us by our old friends, the people who have inside knowledge about this matter. We don't know who these people are. We don't know whether they're European officials, they probably are, by the way, or American officials, or journalists, or who they might be. Most likely, I'm guessing that this information is coming from people in Europe. The White House has categorically denied the story. They said that nobody has thought about or considered or floated the idea of Chinese peacekeepers being sent to Ukraine. Now, a few hours ago, the Chinese said exactly the same thing. They also said that they have no plans, there's been no discussions about sending Chinese peacekeepers to Ukraine. I'm going to read extracts from the article by Zhao Yusha, which appears in Global Times, which, as I've said on many occasions, is a newspaper published, a Chinese newspaper published by the publishing arm of the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of China's Communist Party. So it is an authoritative newspaper. And it says, the title of this article is White House Denies Report of Chinese Peacekeepers in Post-War Ukraine. Hype of US, Europe is political agenda, says expert. Anyway, I'm not going to read the whole article, but it says this. Although the Chinese Foreign Ministry has publicly denied, some in Europe are continuing to hype the information regarding so-called China sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. In a self-contradictory report, the Financial Times continued to hype this idea. The Financial Times, citing 4 people briefed on the matter, claimed on Saturday that during a meeting at the White House last week with European leaders and Ukraine's president, Trump suggested deploying Chinese troops as peacekeepers in post-war Ukraine. However, the Financial Times report also claimed the White House denied it. And then there are quotes from Global Times of the various denials from the White House. And we're then told that when asked to comment on the report by German-based Die Welt newspaper, the diplomatic representatives from EU countries claiming that China expressed its willingness to participate in a potential international peacekeeping force in Ukraine. This is from Global Times. Guo Ziekun, spokesperson from China's foreign ministry, said on August 25th, the report is not true. China's position on the Ukraine crisis is consistent and clear. And that was what Guo said. So here we have a story denied on the 25th of August by China, denied yesterday by the White House, by the Trump administration, and it is still circulating in the European media. I'm going to say straightforwardly, if Trump really had told Zelensky and the Europeans during those meetings in the White House that yes, there was a possibility that Chinese troops could be patrolling Ukraine, I am sure we would have seen leaks about that immediately. And we have seen, I remember that we saw none. I would have expected the Europeans and the Ukrainians to push back on it then, and there is no evidence that they ever did. So the whole story seems to me shaky to the point of being absurd. And yet there it is in the Financial Times. The people briefed about the matter are busy spreading this story, and the Financial Times continues to write about it and report it. There is another similar, not quite as bad case in the Daily Telegraph today. The Daily Telegraph has a long article about the discussions that are supposedly taking place about deploying European peacekeepers to Ukraine. And there's now claims that the Trump administration is looking for ways to actually find private contractors to play a role in this troop deployment. And we're then told in the article itself that though Donald Trump has ruled out boots on the ground in Ukraine, the Europeans, if these private contractors are indeed, American private contractors are indeed deployed to Ukraine, the Europeans will treat this as boots, American boots on the ground. So already we see a tension, but maybe not an outright contradiction. But then we go on to read later in the same article that many European governments are extremely concerned about this whole issue. They're not convinced that the Russians have agreed or will ever agree to the deployment of European peacekeepers to Ukraine. In fact, that is absurd because we know that the Russians have made clear multiple times that they have not agreed and will not agree to the deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. And then we go on to read again in the same Daily Telegraph article that European governments doubt the strength of the US commitment to support these troops in European troops in Ukraine, and that puts a question mark even over the story about European American contractors being sent there. The one fairly confident thing we could say about this issue is that Elbridge Colby, who is of course Assistant Secretary for Defense in the United States, has apparently warned the Europeans that the US role in providing Ukraine security guarantees and this idea of military deployments is connected with these security guarantees. The US role is going to be minimal, which again, it seems to me, cuts across this whole idea. But to repeat again, I have never seen anywhere any clear statement from the President, from the administration, that they are giving any sort of backstop or guarantee to protect European troops in Ukraine. I've never seen any straightforward statement to that effect. And we learn from this article in the Daily Telegraph that there are European governments that have noted this fact and are worried about it and are therefore casting doubt on this entire scheme. So we see that the European media is running amok. They're publishing stories and making claims which appear to me to have either threadbare basis in actual fact or which might in fact have no basis in any fact, which is how, by the way, I treat this whole story about Chinese peacekeepers. Is it really plausible that the United States is going to agree to deployments of the Chinese military in Ukraine, which is, of course, geographically, culturally, in the opinion of its leaders and many of its people, politically, a part of Europe? Given the tensions between the United States and China, I simply cannot believe so. So anyway, if Vance is pushing back about these stories, I can understand why. And I would say as well that there is a clear sense of anger, at least I get the impression of real anger on Vance's part in his posts. And I suspect that this reflects growing anger by at least some people in the administration as well. So here we see tensions starting to grow between the Americans and the Europeans, perhaps within the US itself, between different people within the administration. It's clear to me that Kellogg and Witkoff, despite claims that they're working in harness with each other, are going in completely different directions, just to say. But anyway, we could see tensions. And, well, it's difficult. All of this makes it very difficult for insiders like me to get a true sense of exactly where we are. Having said that, coming back to what Vance said, it's important here to look to what the Russians themselves have been saying. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that they are not prepared to agree to one-sided security guarantees being provided to Ukraine by any NATO country. They have made it absolutely clear that they must have a word on the question of what those security guarantees are. I discussed in my program yesterday that the Foreign Ministry in Moscow has said that the security guarantees that Ukraine will receive will be the product, not a stepping stone towards the eventual settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, that the Russians clearly envisage the security guarantees being on the lines of what was agreed in the Istanbul Agreement in April 2022, and that the Russians are not interested in going beyond this, and moreover, that the Russians have repeatedly and categorically ruled out NATO deployments in Ukraine. I am going to state my own view here. If the Europeans really wanted to get a clear picture of what the Russian position is and what the American position is, it's very simple. They could get clarity from the Americans, but they could also get clarity from the Russians. To repeat a point I have made many times, to repeat a point which was recently made by Owen Matthews in the Daily Telegraph, nothing prevents European officials from contacting the Russians, from sending their own emissary to Moscow, from picking up the telephone and talking to Lavrov or talking to Putin and getting a clear statement from the Russians of what the Russian position is. If they don't want to do what I do every day, which is read TASS, they are welcome to do that instead. They can talk to Putin and Lavrov, and those people will make it clear for them. There is no reason, therefore, for confusion on any one of these issues. So why is all this muddle happening? Why do we see all of these attempts to undermine Witkoff taking place? Why do we have all of these extraordinary briefings about things to the media? The story about the Chinese peacekeepers, which has been denied by both the Chinese and American governments. The story about European forces and, well, perhaps American contractors being sent to Ukraine, and all of those things. Well, I'm going to say that it is very simple. It is not difficult ultimately to understand it at all. The Europeans probably have multiple reasons for wasting their time doing these things, talking about security guarantees, talking about troop deployments to Ukraine, talking in this way. I've discussed in previous programs how the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer seems much more interested and absorbed by foreign policy than by domestic policy. Domestic policy involves dealing with problems that are exceptionally difficult politically and which are indeed perhaps for him insurmountable. You could argue that the same is true of President Macron. Both Macron and Starmer are now looking at a major crisis over the next few weeks. Both have a very difficult budget to try to sell. In both cases, budgets that will probably try to cut spending and increase taxes, and which are guaranteed to be unpopular, and for which arguably there is little public or political support. So how much easier to waste time or rather to give one's time to shuffling troops around, troops who don't exist, because the British Army numbers just 75,000 men, and the total force it can deploy is optimistically put by some people at 30,000, but is realistically far less than that. And Britain has, well, according to some claims, 25 operational tanks. Others say 40 operational tanks. The same apparently is true about the situation with the French military and the German military too. So all of these militaries really not able to patrol Ukraine or deter the Russians there. But as I say, how much easier to shuffle invisible armies around the Ukrainian map, how much easier to talk about security guarantees for Ukraine, how much easier to make public statements condemning the Russians than to deal with these impossibly difficult problems at home where the situation is worsening every day. So I do think that there is one very strong element of that in this. But I think ultimately the major reason why the Europeans are doing this, why they're rigging up stories about Chinese peacekeepers and American contractors and buffer zones and European troop deployments and all of these sort of things, is because they want to wreck the entire peace initiative that Witkoff and Trump and, by the way, Putin, Dmitriev and Lavrov are trying to put together. They don't want the Americans and the Russians talking with each other. They were horrified when Trump first telephoned Putin back in February. They were deeply alarmed when the Americans and the Russians met for the first time in Saudi Arabia without the Europeans or the Ukrainians being present. They made no secret of their distaste for the summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska. It goes beyond, in my opinion, all questions, any questions about economic links or trade agreements or even Ukraine. It's just that the Europeans don't want the Americans and the Russians talking to each other and perhaps working towards each other and making some kind of understanding, reaching some kind of understandings with each other that will put in question the long-term commitment of the United States to Europe. And ultimately, to say this again, this is what the whole conflict in Ukraine, in my opinion, has been all about, at least from a European point of view. It is about keeping the United States engaged, involved in a long, permanent conflict with Russia. The Europeans are unnerved by suggestions that the United States might want to redeploy its forces to the Far East, to East Asia. They're known to have deep misgivings about Elbridge Colby and his outlook about things in the Far East. And for that reason, they're prepared to bend over backwards to accommodate even the most extravagant American demands, like, for example, the demands about tariffs which Donald Trump imposed on them a few weeks ago, provided they can ensure that the United States remains in Europe. If humiliating themselves by going to the White House and huddling around the Resolute desk in the Oval Office is part of the price they have to pay to achieve that objective, well, obviously they will pay that price. The priority is to stop any peace initiative, to keep the war going, and if possible, eventually to get the Americans to impose those great sanctions on Russia, the tariffs against Russia, which the Europeans tell themselves if they're ever imposed, the Americans will never lift, because the story of American sanctions is that it is almost impossible to lift sanctions once they are imposed. To get those sanctions imposed, which will indefinitely prevent a rapprochement or détente between Russia and the United States from ever taking place. By the way, on that, I should say that there is precedent. During the earlier period of détente in the late 1960s and 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union, as it then was, were indeed moving forward towards agreeing all kinds of economic relationships with each other. The United States seemed for a time to be prepared to grant the Soviet Union most favored nation trade status. And as I remember, though very, very few people I suspect do nowadays, there was even a project that seemed to be moving forward to build Lockheed TriStar jets, big, wide-bodied aircraft. The Soviet Union at that time was short of wide-bodied aircraft because it didn't have the necessarily powerful, big turbofan engines that those kind of aircraft needed. Anyway, there was a project to build Lockheed TriStars in a factory in Voronezh in Russia. I remember it all very, very well. And what then happened was that a coalition of hardliners in Europe and hardliners in the United States, Senator Jackson and people like that, made sure that that didn't happen. There was the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which ensured that Russia did not get, the Soviet Union did not get most favored nation trade status, and that ultimately chilled the entire process of détente, so that in effect, by the early 1980s, it had essentially died. So this is essentially the game as far as I can see, that is being played today. And, well, we saw that with certain further comments that President Zelensky of Ukraine appeared to be making yesterday. I find it sometimes very difficult to understand exactly what it is that President Zelensky means on any occasion. His comments are often not very coherent, at least I don't find them so. But anyway, he was, unsurprisingly, trying to make the most of the Russian attack, the missile and drone attack on Kiev, and he was complaining about that drone attack, and he was saying that this proves that the Russians are not interested in negotiations. And he said that unless the Russians agreed to something, I'm not completely clear what it was that they were supposed to agree to, but anyway, agreed to negotiate in earnest, as far as I could tell, by Monday, by tomorrow, in fact, then some kind of deadline supposedly agreed by the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and Trump in Washington during all of those meetings would have expired, and the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians would then take some kind of action. And I presume he means tariffs and sanctions and those sort of things. Now, what I presume he is referring to, Zelensky is referring to, was certain comments by President Trump at the time that it would require 2 weeks for him to get a sense of whether or not the negotiating process was going anywhere and whether the Russians, Putin, was serious about negotiations. And of course, if my calendrical understanding is correct, tomorrow, on Monday, that 2-week period ends. So presumably what Zelensky is saying is that the Russians must now make some move tomorrow which will satisfy Trump, perhaps agree to a bilateral summit meeting with Zelensky himself, which of course the Russians have rejected, or the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians will then go ahead and do something. And it's not difficult to guess what Zelensky means. It means massive tariffs and sanctions and all of those things against Russia, the very things that were being talked about in July and early August, the things that Zelensky was perhaps expecting Trump to impose on the 8th of August, but which never happened because Trump instead sent Witkoff to Moscow and the meeting in Anchorage took place. So you can see here Zelensky trying to use certain words of Trump's, which I think fell well short of imposing any particular deadline, and trying also to use the events in the missile and drone strike in Kiev, like the other European leaders, to try to get Trump to come out, make statements condemning the drone and missile strike in Kiev, announce that the Russians are not interested in peace, and announce the tariffs and sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal have been agitating for, and which of course Trump himself has threatened. Well, I doubt that anything like that is going to happen tomorrow. And for the record, Trump has also said that he's not happy with Zelensky either. He doesn't see Zelensky as having made any moves towards peace. And there are reports that he's not happy with the Europeans too. And one can fully understand why. But anyway, that I think is the European and Ukrainian objective. They want to keep the war going. They want to prevent a rapprochement between the United States and Russia, or if not a rapprochement, at least a détente, or even a dialogue, and they want to cut off that option entirely by manoeuvring Trump back to imposing sanctions and tariffs against Russia and ultimately its trading partners as well. And, well, Kaja Kallas, the European High Representative for Foreign Policy, she came out and made statements which essentially said the same thing. She said that it's important to get the Russians to negotiations. The attacks on Kiev conclusively proved that Putin is not interested in peace. So the only thing the Russians understand is pressure. Kaja Kallas said that we have seen that the only thing that the Russians understand is pressure. So we must apply pressure upon the Russians to force them to the negotiating table. And again, it's not difficult to work out what she's referring to. She means these massive sanctions and tariffs on the Russians that, Zelensky is also agitating for, and Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal are agitating for. And by the way, Keith Kellogg within the administration is agitating for also. If I could just make a quick observation about Kaja Kallas's comment. She says that experience has shown that the only thing that works with the Russians is to put pressure on them. What pressure exactly does she mean? Because we've had now more than 3.5 years of putting pressure on the Russians. The European Union has applied 18 packages of sanctions on the Russians. The United States and the European Union have armed Ukraine repeatedly. They have micromanaged in the past Ukraine's military operations, as we've learnt from the New York Times and the London Times. They've equipped Ukraine with fighter jets, surface-to-air missiles, long-range cruise missiles, including supersonic ballistic missiles, tanks, armoured vehicles. They provided enormous amounts of money for Ukraine. They've frozen the central bank's assets. They've talked about trying to turn the ruble into rubble. They've spoken about trying to force Russia's entire economy to halve in size. They have worked incessantly and continuously to try to pressure Russia. Has it worked? Is there any sign at all that it has worked? Kaja Kallas says there is. She provides no examples that I'm aware of. I am not aware of any examples. At the moment, after all this pressure, after more than 3.5 years of pressure, after sanctions that extend back to 2014, it is the Russian army which continues to advance in Ukraine. It is the Russians who are outproducing the West in weapon systems. According to the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, they're producing 4 times the number of weapons that the combined collective West is. So where is this evidence that the Russians actually are capable of being persuaded or forced to back down through applying pressure? What Kaja Kallas is saying is that we should go on doing the same thing again and again and again, and doing even more of it, even though far from succeeding, as she has alleged it would, repeatedly alleged it would, it has, on the contrary, consistently failed. Anyway, that's Kaja Kallas. Maybe one shouldn't spend too much time trying to research or understand the very strange and difficult and complex and bizarre things that she says. But anyway, that is Kaja Kallas. The Europeans, the Ukrainians, pushing constantly for an end to all dialogue between the United States and Russia. We see, this is my own sense, that there are some people in the administration that are getting frustrated and are trying to push back against this, people like Vance and perhaps Witkoff. It's interesting that Vance is speaking up for Witkoff, and it does suggest to me that the two of them together do form something of at least a community of view. I won't say a faction, I don't believe that, but certainly a community of view. But of course there are others in the United States who think otherwise, and anyway, this whole process teeters on the edge. Now, if the Europeans are becoming increasingly aggressive in trying to unravel this process, I'm starting to get the sense that the Russians on their part are also becoming increasingly frustrated as well. Now, not all Russians. Kirill Dmitriev, the director of Russia's Direct Investment Fund, Witkoff's primary interlocutor in Moscow, the person who's attended meetings with Witkoff on many occasions and who's always accompanied Putin in Putin's various meetings with Witkoff, he continues to talk up the possibility of some kind of détente between Russia and the United States and some kind of dialogue between Russia and the United States. But I'm going to return now to the topic of that Russian missile strike in Kiev, the one that took place 3 days ago. And of course, as I said, we've now had a subsequent strike by the Russians, which has taken place over the last couple of hours, about which, by the way, as at the time of making of this program, I know very little. Now, let me just make a few observations about this. The Europeans appear to be extremely upset and dismayed by this strike. They've called in, as I said, the Russian ambassadors across Europe. The argument being that the Russians launched missiles close to the European Union's representative office and the office of the British Council, though it is now accepted in the media that neither of those two buildings was specifically targeted. I wonder whether over the course of that strike on Kiev, the Russians might not have been not just hitting certain very important targets in which the Europeans might have an interest, but also might have been giving the Europeans themselves some kind of a warning. Just to say, now I say this because two people have at the very least floated that possibility. One is Alistair Crook, who sees in this strike and in other actions taken by the Russians a sign that the Russians are losing patience and are moving towards further escalation. That the strike near the European representative office and the British Council was indeed, at the very least, provocative and was possibly a warning, and attacks on what might have been other sensitive installations which the Russians have hesitated to attack before, but the attack upon which appears to have caused dismay in European capitals, that is a sign that the Russians are now increasingly starting to pull the gloves off. And, well, Daniel Davis has also suggested, floated, I think, a very similar possibility that the missile strikes close to the European Representative Office and to the British Council building might have been intended as a warning to the Europeans as well. Now, I discounted that theory, but thinking about it more, I wonder whether both Daniel Davis and Alistair Crook might be right, whether it is indeed the case that the Russians, who are now increasingly making the point that the Europeans are trying to wreck the entire process of dialogue between Russia and the United States, that the Europeans need a proper warning from Moscow to step back. Dmitriev has been talking in this way, and another person who's been talking in this way in Moscow has been the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov. He's also said that the Europeans are trying to wreck the entire process of discussion between the United States and Russia. And one can understand what the Russians perhaps might be thinking, which is that despite repeated warnings and statements from Moscow that the deployment of European peacekeepers, or so-called peacekeepers, to Ukraine, NATO peacekeepers to Ukraine, is unacceptable and will invite a reaction from Russia. And by the way, Redovka, the Russian newspaper, published in Smolensk, actually carried an article about this. There was an interview with a senior Russian military official. He's now retired, but it actually said that if European peacekeepers were indeed introduced into Ukraine, the Russians would indeed take strong action against them. Anyway, it could be that the Russians are starting to say to themselves, the Europeans are continuing to make these comments. They're continuing to talk and publish these elaborate plans about deploying NATO peacekeepers, European peacekeepers to Ukraine. They're not listening to what we are saying. So the moment has come for us to make clear to the Europeans that when we are giving these warnings, we are indeed in earnest. And that might explain the missile strikes close to the European Representative Office and to the British Council. The Russians are saying, look, we have the capability. We can strike at your troops if they ever are deployed in Ukraine. We have the capability to do it, and we have the will to do it too. We're giving you a strong warning. Ignore it at your own risk. And of course, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, said a couple of days ago that sections of the Russian military had tried to persuade, and Russian intelligence agencies had tried to persuade Putin to authorize an Oresnik strike against decision-making centers in Kiev, but Putin refused and said that this would be unacceptable because of the risk to civilians of a strike of that kind. I'd assumed that the decision-making centers were political centers, Bankova, where Zelensky has his office, and those kind of things. But it is widely known that there are European and American officials permanently based in Kiev, supervising and doing all kinds of things. And maybe that warning, that statement, that comment from Lukashenko, leaking the fact that a request of that very same nature to Putin had been made was indeed also intended to reinforce the various warnings that the Russians are making now. So I'm not exactly sure if these missile strikes in Kiev, if Lukashenko's comments, if the comments from Dmitriev and Ryabkov were indeed intended to be warnings to the Europeans, telling them, look, for heaven's sake, shut up about this idea of NATO peacekeepers. We said no, and we mean no, and you must take no for an answer. If that is indeed what the Russians are trying to do, I am fairly confident that the Russians are also providing internal warnings, private warnings through various intermediaries that this is the case. And I suspect that the Europeans are receiving these warnings. And all of that might perhaps explain some of the alarm and dismay and the anger in European capitals and some of the tensions between the Europeans and the Americans at this time. If the Europeans feel that they are being threatened and are interpreting Trump's refusal to criticize the strikes in Kiev as a sign that the Americans are not going to stand by them or are not standing by them, then that might explain some of the alarm in Europe. And it might also explain some of these strange stories that are appearing in the media that I discussed earlier in the programme, and the media attacks on Witkoff. And to be very clear, I think this story about Chinese peacekeepers in Ukraine almost certainly is intended to damage Donald Trump. It's intended to imply that he's still somehow closely involved with the Russians, and that even as he will not take steps to protect Ukraine, he's prepared to allow Russia's great ally, China, to deploy troops to Ukraine instead. So anyway, this is perhaps how it all looks. I would just add quickly before I move on that the president of Portugal has just made some extraordinary comments, the details of which I will admit I haven't fully read, but he's also made some extraordinary comments in which he apparently also, again, appears to allude to the earlier allegations that there was some kind of collusion between President Trump and the Russians. And, of course, in Britain, from time to time, the former British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, writes articles and makes public statements that does the same thing. So anyway, there we are. A fraught and tense time, but obviously no sign of any progress in the diplomacy. Zelensky refuses, as far as I can see, to make any counter-proposals to the Russian proposals. He has not agreed to the Russian proposal, to set up 3 working parties to explore possible ways forward. He apparently shows no interest in reviving the discussions in Istanbul, which he's never been happy with. All of the talk in Europe is about security guarantees and European troop deployments, which even some European governments have made clear their own skepticism about. And for the moment, it looks as if the entire diplomacy and negotiating process is stuck. I suspect that for there to be any serious prospect of reviving it and taking it forward, we have to see further big changes of the situation on the ground. And it is to that now I'm going to turn, though I will only discuss this, as this is well on into this video, in relatively brief terms again. Yesterday there were lots of reports on various Russian telegram channels that the Ukrainians attempted a major counterattack in the Pokrovsk area, and supposedly units of the various Azov brigades, there's now several of them, participated in this attack. And according to the Russians, the attack was completely unsuccessful, and the Ukrainians were thrown back with heavy losses. I've not seen any confirmation of this report from from the Ukrainians, obviously, or from any neutral channels. And, well, there's been, if anything, again, a reduction of information about the situation in Pokrovsk, though to repeat once more, the Russians have, by general admission, enlarged the territory that they control in the southwest of Pokrovsk. I don't think there's any real dispute any longer that they control Leontovichi, the village, if it is a village, the suburb of Pokrovsk in the southwest. Video footage of Russian troops there has appeared in ways that strongly suggests that they do indeed control this position. And, well, there are reports that the Russians have continued to enlarge their various areas of control around Pokrovsk. Now, there's also been claims that the Ukrainians did try to carry out some kind of counterattack in the Mirnograd Novoekonomichny area, that's to say at the eastern end of this battle, the southeastern end of this battle. There were even some claims about a couple of days ago that the Ukrainians had managed to carry out some deep advance in this area, that it was executed by the 79th Brigade. There is now general agreement that if such an attack did indeed take place, that it was repelled successfully by the Russians. And there are now reports, claims, rumors that some Ukrainian troops sent on this counterattack have been left behind by the retreating Ukrainians behind Russian lines and are now cut off and are being mopped up by the Russians. I suspect a counterattack in this area did indeed take place. I doubt that it ever had the success that it did. The Ukrainians have been reporting counterattacks in many places. They published very, very elaborate claims about the counterattack they carried out in the breakthrough area that the Russians achieved northeast of Pokrovsk. There were lots of stories that the Ukrainians had recaptured around 60% of the territory that the Russians had captured over the course of the breakthrough. There were stories that the Ukrainians had pushed the Russians back from central Pokrovsk. I think that over the last couple of days, it's become increasingly clear, though the information continues to be fragmentary, that those Ukrainian claims were overstated and that the Russians are not only still present in central Pokrovsk, but that they retain most of the territory that they control in the breakthrough area as well, that they captured, rather, the territory that they captured in the area, in the breakthrough area. And, well, we've had other claims. I mean, the Ukrainians have also claimed that they've conducted a counterattack in the Liman direction. There have been many claims of Ukrainian counterattacks in the Liman direction. They recently claimed to have driven the Russians out of a village in the West Donetsk area where the Russians have been advancing. This has been a very strange story because the village in question has always been some deep, well, not deep, but well inside Ukrainian lines. No one up to now has put the Russians within strike distance of this village. But we had reports that the Russians captured this village and then that the Ukrainians have recaptured this village, all within the space of a few hours. It may be that something like that did indeed happen. It could be that there was a Russian raiding party that reached this village, occupied some buildings for a short time, and then pulled back. But I have to say, increasingly, I am starting to sense again that some of these Ukrainian counterattacks that we read about on a fairly regular basis have an invented character about them. They're intended to give the impression that the Ukrainians are still able to attack in various places, when in fact, because of their confirmed shortages of manpower and equipment, realistically, it is all but impossible for them to do such a thing. So anyway, that's some of the things that we've been hearing over the last 24 hours. But overall, the picture continues to be the same. We get more reports of Russian advances. I've discussed them in the Pokrovsk area. More reports about Russian advances in the Konstantinovka area. I am fairly confident that the Kliban Big area, the area to the south of the reservoir, is now fully under Russian control. Just saying. Russian advances in the Siversk area. Our old friend Andrei Marochko has just told TASS that the Russians are 500 meters from Siversk, advancing upon Siversk from the northeast, which means another area advance. That doesn't seem to me to refer to the Russian positions east of Siversk in Verkhokamyanska. And, well, there have been many reports now about the Ukrainians preparing to retreat from Kupiansk. But of course, unsurprisingly, over the last couple of hours, we've had all the stories again about a Ukrainian counterattack in the Kupiansk area. Again, I wonder whether that counterattack has really happened, or whether, again, it's intended to somehow sugarcoat the bad news, the increasingly bad news from Kupiansk, where apparently the Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk, who are cut off from resupply, have been making increasingly urgent requests to be allowed to retreat. And in the Zaporozhye area, there are, I think, confirmed Russian advances, both from the south, in the area of the village of Malaya Tokmachka, which, by the way, the Russians seem to be having great trouble capturing. It was a major base for the Ukrainian counter-offensive in the summer of 2023, and I suspect that this particular village is heavily fortified. But certainly that the Russians do appear to be advancing towards Zaporozhye city from the south, from Kamenskaya, from Plavny, which they now apparently either control or mostly control, through Stepnogorsk, of which they have apparently captured significant parts, and of the settlement of Primorsky, which is located a little to the north, a big settlement apparently, and which if the Russians were to capture, it would bring them very close to the city of Zaporozhye indeed. And the Russians do appear to be continuing to advance towards the city of Zaporozhye from the east. And latest reports are putting the Russians in positions not far from a village called Veliko Mikhailovka, which, just to say, is plainly visible on my Google map of the city of Zaporozhye, and which puts if the Russians were to capture it, it would mean that the Russians are again in a position to cut some of the main supply roads in this area too. So the Russian advance, the lava flow continues, and it continues to move inexorably. Now, the Moon of Alabama has done an interesting piece on this rather strange story that was floating around some days ago, which started with a report in the Wall Street Journal about this Iran cruise missile, of which the United States supposedly is going to supply 3,350 to Ukraine. And this originates in an article which appeared in the Wall Street Journal, published a week ago, which said that the United States is prepared to supply 3,350 of these air-launched missiles to Ukraine, and that Ukraine would be receiving them in about 6 weeks at a cost of $850 million, with most of the money provided by European states. And we're told that whilst this missile has a range of 150 to 280 miles, Ukraine would need approval from the Pentagon to launch them, presumably, onto targets in Russia. Now, I did some research, and I couldn't find much evidence that this missile, which we're told is a simplified and cheap missile, even exists. And I was, to be frank, somewhat baffled by the story. But this article, The Moon of Alabama, has actually looked into this story in more detail. And it says that this missile appears to be an adaptation of an American bomb, and it has some kind of jet engine added. And it's a project which was launched last year, and it's far from clear that it has resulted so far in any actual usable items. It claims that 2 companies have been involved in this project. One is Zone 5 Technologies, a company completely unknown to me, by the way, though that doesn't mean a great deal. And this company, in March, produced some kind of a prototype, but nothing more than that. And then there is another company called Co-Aspire, which has also produced rather more prototypes using apparently some kind of 3D printing. And this particular variant of the missile, if it can be called a missile, rather than some kind of extended range bomb, that this variant uses some kind of turbojet engine. Well, it looks to me all very preliminary, and again, it does remind me of that project that I did discuss in an earlier program, the small diameter bomb that was going to be launched by the HIMARS missiles, and that project proved unsuccessful. I'm going to say here my own personal view. It could be that a number of these missiles or jet-powered bombs, if you prefer, do actually exist, but probably not yet in the number of 3,350. Maybe Ukraine will receive some of these weapons over the next few weeks, the 6 weeks that the Wall Street Journal is saying. But this doesn't look remotely like a game-changing weapon to me, and I doubt that the Russians will have much difficulty dealing with this weapon on the battlefront. And as the Moon of Alabama points out, Ukraine simply doesn't have large numbers of aircraft to launch them. So again, I am not going to completely dismiss this story. Probably some type of weapon is going to be supplied to Ukraine over the next couple of weeks, but it's just another weapon in the endless number of weapons that the West has supplied to Ukraine. None of them has proved to be a magic bullet. Many of them have been presented as being such at various times, but not one of them, not the HIMARS, not the Bayraktar drones, not the F-16s, not the Leopard 2s and Abrams tanks, not the M777 howitzers, about which, by the way, I noticed that I've heard virtually nothing for several weeks now. Not one of them has made a significant difference on the actual field of battle. And I cannot imagine that these weapons are going to be any different either. So anyway, the very last thing I would say before I sign off is that even as the Americans may be on the brink of supplying some kind of, well, let's call it jet-powered bomb to the Ukrainians, the Russians have provided evidence that they have acquired a capability, which, by the way, it has surprised me how long it has taken them to acquire, but they have just demonstrated that they now operate sea-launched underwater or sea-launched underwater drones in the Black Sea, something that the Ukrainians, of course, have been doing for some time. And the Russians used this drone for the first time in a river area close to Odessa to destroy a Ukrainian reconnaissance ship, the Simferopol, named after a city in Crimea, by the way, just to say. And this was some kind of electronic intelligence gathering ship, as far as I can understand, and is one of the few remaining largish ships in the Ukrainian Navy. But anyway, this drone approached it, and it seems to have the ability to move it and change speed. And it's not clear to me how it was controlled, but it's clear that the Ukrainians didn't expect it, and the Russians attacked the ship and destroyed it. So it looks to me as if the Russians have a more sophisticated version of this drone technology than the ones the Ukrainians have been using up to now. But anyway, it's taken them about 2 years to produce this technology, but no doubt we'll start to see it more in use in the Black Sea over the next few weeks and months. Well, there we are. I suspect that this is, as I said, where the war will be decided on the battlefield. And in the meantime, and just to say, Vladimir Putin is heading for Tianjin in China, where he will be meeting with President Modi and President Xi, and I will be discussing all of that in my program tomorrow. Well, this is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.